a thought experiment that I wanted to verbalize and record. It has to do with banking and morals and usury and economics and all sorts of stuff. Sprinkle some philosophy in there. On the show, we talk a lot about economics, and obviously, if you've listened to any amount of time, we come at it from an MMT angle, which is contrary to most other views on economics. And MMT, of course, again, if you've listened to this, if you haven't listened to it, be prepared to hear some wild ideas that you'll probably vehemently disagree with and will want to fight with me over. That you are more than welcome to, because I enjoy such things. But the premise behind MMT is that the government prints the money first and taxes money later, as opposed to taxing money first and then spending it later. And that because a government, talking specifically about the United States here, because they have the sole monopoly power of creation of currency, if they don't actually spend more than they tax, then there isn't enough money left over for the private sector to work with. Meaning, deficits are good. You have to have them in order for a functioning economy. So when we add on to that the banking system and recognize that banks, just like the government, create money out of nothing, but they do so with the authority of the government. However, there is a specific difference between government money and banking money. Government money gets created, and even though there's this whole treasury bills and bond auctions and interest rates and all this sorts of stuff, at the end of the day, the government doesn't have any real constraint on its creation of money outside of what the members decide they want to constrain it as. I mean, they literally have a printer that they can push a button, and as much money as they want comes out of it, and the only constraint is how much they push that button. And any interest rates are just them pushing the button again, right? I mean, if you have the power to create money from the special magic money printer whenever you want, if you owe somebody interest, you just press the button again, right? So this whole thing about the government needing to collect money in order to pay its debts, it's just a bunch of nonsense. So when we add the banking system to that, the banking system is different because the government prints the money. It doesn't actually need it back to afford anything. By law, when I say by law, I mean the law is what defines all of these things. Money is a legal concept, and how banks operate with money and create money and destroy money and utilize money, this is all legal stuff. So by law, the banks are able to create money whenever they make a loan. Like you start a business, you buy a house, you buy a car, or whatever, and you get a loan from the bank. Loan is kind of a misnomer, I would say. It's exactly that. The money is actually generated for that purpose. Now, when that money is generated, you obviously have to pay the money back with interest. Now, here's where things get really interesting, is that the principal that gets paid back to the bank destroys the money. It's gone. The interest that gets paid back to the bank is the money the bank gets to stick in their pocket and say, that's the money we made. Now, in the event of a default, now that money... in the event of a default, the interest is gone. I mean, maybe the bank can write it off on their taxes or something, the interest that they were owed. But the money that was supposed to be paid back as principal, weirdly enough, stays in the economic system. Like it hasn't gotten paid back to be destroyed. But the bank is now responsible for seeing that as a loss on their books, and they have to make up for it as a loss on their books with more profits later. I mean, for example, I borrow $100,000, I pay $50,000 of it back plus interest, and then I default on the other $50,000. Even though all that principal that I paid back to the bank evaporated back into the bank void, the $50,000 that I didn't pay back is now hey, we just lost $50,000 that we have to make up over the bank. So after I read, I wanted to say real quickly, but Dr. E. Michael Jones' book, which was Barren Metal, a history of economics as the conflict between labor and usury. And Dr. Jones is obviously a Catholic, and he has this Catholic view of history and this Catholic interpretation on usury, which is to say he defines usury as any interest whatsoever, it doesn't matter how small it is sinful. It's theft. It's a form of theft because the person collecting the interest is not engaging in any risk to earn that money back. And now I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that definition, because as someone who has now lent money and particularly I've not lent money, I've borrowed money. I've borrowed money particularly to acquire a business. I've borrowed money from the banking system to acquire a business, and now I probably get somewhere between 4 and 10 phone calls a day from these money brokers and private lenders or something that say, "Oh my God, I've got the best rates," and I mean they'll send me these text messages like, if I had if I was able to get you $200,000 a day, would you sign? It's like, okay, anybody talking to you like that? You better not sign that damn thing, right? So when these people first started calling me, and I'm talking about this because I think there's two categorical differences of usury. With the bank loan that I took, I was too glassy-eyed and excited about acquiring a business, and I didn't realize that I was taking an adjustable rate loan, which not like I ruined my business or anything when interest rates went up, but it did suck. I think I went from like 8% to 11%. And but whether it's 8 or 11, I got that loan with the cash flow in mind to make sure that the cash flow that's coming in for the business can always cover the debt service, right? And I think 11's kind of pushing it, but at 8 or whatever, or particularly if you get down to 6 or 5 or 2 or 3 or something like that, as long as the amount of interest doesn't create a burden which is beyond the cash flow of the business to handle, that's one category. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's one category. Then we have the other category of these dorkwads who call me that say, "Oh, I have the best rates. I can get you the money the fastest," and whatever. And at first I used to listen to the pitches. Then I went through a phase of, as soon as they contact me, I'd write them back and I go, "What are your rates and fees?" And, "Oh, well, no fees. But it's the best rates. It's the best rates." And I can do the math. And Dr. E. Michael Jones points this out at some point in history, where that even when usury was banned in the medieval era and the early modern era, you get these fees that start to suspiciously look like interest rates. So I get these offers from these guys where if I did the math, if I took the actual interest rate and the fee that they would take, and with a fee, I mean, it's like, hey, you need $180,000. Okay, we can get you that with a 5% interest rate, or not 5, it'd be more like 10 or 12 or something like that. Get you a 10% interest rate, but we have a $15,000 fee up front. And it's like, well, how long do I have to pay this back? Oh, you have a year. And I'm like, okay, wait, if you're taking $15,000 out of $180,000 over 1 year, I mean, let me just pull up a freaking calculator. It's like, oh, so that's 8% right on top of whatever thing that you got me, right? However, how much money you got me, and that actually doesn't even sound that bad if I add 8% on top of the 10% or whatever I said, because we're getting to 18, 20 when I say that. Typically, when I did the math, because often maybe a year was too long. A lot of these things, they want to lend you the money for 5 months, right? They want $15,000 for money lent to you over 5 months. Well, that just more than doubles the interest rate when you do the math and annualize it, right? And so when I would calculate these things, they would come back when I would take whatever fees and rates and whatever and stick them all together over the amount of time of the loan. Fuckers would come back at like 279% interest annualized. Just unreal. I'm like, are you guys out of your fucking mind? Like, I would say, who agrees to this? But I know people agree to it, otherwise there wouldn't be in business. There wouldn't be 400 of these dudes calling me every day. And at that amount of money, 279% or whatever the heck it is. I mean, even, I think the best deal I actually got that I sat down and listened to was 40%. 40%. That is an amount of money where you might as well take the profits of your business as soon as you get them and go, okay, here you go, lender, they're all yours. That's usury. Holy shit, that's usury, right? That's someone just gutting a business and taking all the productive capacity out of a business just for the act of lending money. And I mean, I know there's the argument, well, that this company has risk. Well, I risk that you're not going to pay back the money. Well, I mean, first of all, they require a personal guarantee so they can go after you personally in order to get that money. Second of all, I have the nagging suspicion. Haven't been in the industry myself, but let's say I did take that money, I didn't pay it back. Well, they sell it to a collector for 50 cents on the dollar or whatever the heck it is. And then the collector chases you down to get what they can. So, in part of their business model is to say, okay, if we lend out and we don't go through the typical underwriting procedures that a real bank would do, that's because real banks are banks, that a real bank would do, that we can expect a certain amount of default. Well, based on that certain amount of default, and we know that we can get 50 cents on the dollar, if we have to sell to a creditor, then we know that, okay, as long as we're hitting this interest rate and collecting this many fees, we're still profitable. Well, I mean, whatever that business calculation is, at the end of the day, they know they're lending to companies that can't afford it. They're lending to people who don't understand the math, and they're finding people who are desperate, who can't understand the math, who are willing to take on this money, willing to borrow this money that's just going to glut them out. Of course, that's freaking usury by any definition, and I would say that is completely theft. Now, where exactly the line is between the first one I said and the second one I said, I'm not going to sit here and try to make some mathematical model, but I think it's clear that there is a categorical difference between, okay, I borrowed this money in order to successfully project the business forward. I have successfully projected the business forward. Therefore, I appreciate borrowing the money, even though I have to pay this stupid 11% interest rate on it. Versus, okay, we want 279% by the time that you actually calculate this thing, and that's just raping you sideways and extracting everything out of your business for the fact that we lent you some money. Now, when you have the idea that like there's this time value of money, like, okay, well, sure, but money has a cost to it, and the fact that they could have been using that money somewhere else, they have to be paid to have to use that money now. Well, if you're borrowing money from a person, okay, maybe, but as we just said, the banking system creates the money out of nothing. There is no time value of money like that when you've created the money out of nothing. Right? It's not like they could have taken that money and done something else with it because it doesn't exist yet. So the idea that I had is, even though I'm acknowledging I do believe there's two categorical differences between types of usury, let's just take for the sake of argument that they are both theft. And that even if you say, okay, this category of usury is bad, this category of usury is good, because people don't understand this. I mean, it's so obvious that people don't understand. They do these guys, they're doing the used car salesman thing where they're trying to distract you with these numbers and flipping these numbers over there. The only reason they're doing that is because they're being sneaky. Right? So, if you've had these fees that start to suspiciously look like interest rates, I have the feeling no matter how you created a system to say, okay, this form of usury that we've determined is theft is bad and we want to prevent it, and this form of usury is acceptable because it doesn't destroy whoever borrows it, there's always a way to get creative to pull the money out, even though, we called it a fee, not interest, for example. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's all bad. And I also want to raise the question, in a system, and I'm not talking about people borrowing each other's money. I'm talking about we have a government that has a monopoly over the creation and destruction of currency that extends that monopoly to the banking system, which means we have now this quasi-private, quasi-public money creation arm of society. Why do the people who, in quotes, borrow, they're not borrowing the money, the money gets generated out of nowhere, why does interest need to be paid back on that at all? What purpose does it serve? Now, I can think of two comebacks to that, and I want to address both of them. Well, actually, before I do that, how does the system currently work? Because I've heard this argument before, and it's partially true, is that the way that the banking system is set up, there's not enough money in the system to pay all the debt back by definition. Think about it. If money gets generated by the banking system, and then it has to be paid back in interest, so let's create this closed system where there's just me and the bank. If I borrow $100, and I have to pay $110 back, there's only $100 in existence to pay the $110 loan back. Well, then you say, okay, well, there's many, many players in the system. Okay, let's add a second player. Well, that second player borrows $100, and then, okay, there's $100 to pay the $10 difference now exists within the system to pay the original loan back, but there's still another $10 owed on that next $100. And so now there's $200 in the system, but there's $220 owed back. And every person that we add on is going to add $100 in the system and add $110 of what needs to be paid back. So it doesn't matter how much you grow the system, in aggregate, more money is owed back than is actually in the system. Now, again, that's partially true. That's only true of that. I mean, I used to believe that's the end of the story. It's partially true because it's true for the banking system. It's not true for the government. If you think the government operates under the same rules, you would say, yeah, okay, they need to borrow money and offer to pay interest to attract that money, and then that's how they pay their debts. Well, that puts us in the same boat as the banking system. No, that's not how it works. The government just prints it out of nowhere and leaves it in the system. That's why we call it the private sector net savings. Because the banking system, the liability of the loan and the asset of the loan, so that the borrower has the liability of paying the loan and the bank has the asset of that loan getting paid back. You add them together, they equal zero. With the government money, it doesn't have to be paid back. So when you add it together, you get whatever positive number is left over of how much money has been left in the system by the government. That's the private sector net savings. So right now, the way that the system pays for the additional interest that is consequently, let me rephrase it this way, how the system pays back the amount of money that gets borrowed, even though that amount of money is more than what was borrowed, is that the government can inject the difference. You guys follow me with this? The government injects the difference or that delta between the total principal and the total interest plus principal that needs to be paid back. And we see when that doesn't happen, which we've gone over ad nauseum on this show, that there have been seven economic crashes in U.S. history, not counting the COVID crap, that were all predicated. What happened right before them was either a balancing of the national budget or a reduction in the deficit. And what happens as a result of that is the private sector, in quotes, private sector, the banking system needs to go into debt with itself to continue servicing its debt. However, per the math that I just described, every time you do that, you're adding on more interest plus principal than you are principal within the system to pay everything. So let's relook at this closed system. Right now, we'll have me, the bank, and the government. I borrow $100. I got to pay $110 back. The government prints $20 into existence for public spending. Now, I have enough money to pay the whole thing back, plus the ability to save $10 in aggregate. Follow me so far? So, the question I have, I already brought it up. Why does anybody have to pay this interest to the banking system as a society? Two things I could think of of reasons not to. The first is, the banks have to make money. And we have to have some private nature to the banks, because if it's entirely public, an entirely public institution loses its ability to be flexible. It loses its ability to quickly identify opportunities. And I mean, there's always this thing about having, bank accounts or loans or whatever from the post office, and everyone rolls their eyes like, oh yeah, the post office, it does such a good job on everything else. You're gonna put financial matters into their hands. I think there's an element of truth to that. I would argue, or I would propose, this is what I'm hypothesizing, is that instead of the borrower in quotes, borrower, the receiver of the generated, the temporary receiver of the generated money, right, newly generated money, paying back the interest, which is where the profit from the bank comes from. Why doesn't the government, who creates the money out of nothing to begin with, pay the bank either an interest or fee, or I mean, I don't know how it would break down, but why can't the government just generate that? I mean, think about it. Think about it. So, and I want to talk about specifically about businesses because I want to address assets here differently in a minute. Assets being cars and houses and consumer debt and all that. Not really an asset, but for the sake of what I'm talking about, it is. Businesses, when you lend to businesses, you create money for businesses, it increases the money supply in the system, but it also increases the goods and services in the system to buy with that money. So you get an increase in goods and services. At the same time, you get an increase of money, which is theoretically the healthy balance that you need in order to have growth within an economy. That's good. So now if somebody is doing that at some level, the business owner at some level, it's like a public service to the community. And for the bank to facilitate that public service is also a public service to the community. And again, if we recognize that the bank is only able to generate money to begin with because it has license to do so from the government, it's a government power that is bestowed, boom, on the bank. The current system, as I explained it before, is that for the aggregate to pay back that interest, they have to go chasing the government spending in order to get the savings, the delta, the difference between the money that was generated versus the money that's owed back, in order to pay for that. Meaning, the government's already paying for it. There's just this roundabout way that the in quotes borrower gets that money to pay it back, the aggregate borrower. What about instead of borrowing $100,000 for a business and paying back $110,000, you borrow $100,000 for a business and you pay back $100,000, and it's up to the government to say, okay, you made a good loan. This guy's making his payments on time. He's not defaulting on his debts. So therefore, the government will pay you the interest. And maybe we say, okay, it's not interest, it's a fee because usury is wrong, and that's just a form of usury. And I do want to make there's another point I want to make on this. What is the difference between usury and a fee? Or I should say interest and a fee. Fundamentally, I've heard that in the Islamic world, usury is still banned. And the way they do that is they just generate a fee and they incorporate that fee over the life of the payments that are made over the life of the loan. And they've thereby avoided usury. And someone who's smart could observe, well, wait a minute, isn't that okay, you started with something different, but you ended up to the same thing. So isn't that the same thing? I would say the one difference is this. In our Western system, if you fail to make a payment, that interest clock keeps running. So I'm going to say $120,000 loan. $100,000 loan at 12% interest, because the math becomes easy with a 12-month year, which means you're going to generate 1% of an interest charge every month, right? Because 12 divided by 12 is 1. So on $100,000, you're going to come up with $1,000 of interest, which is going to go down as you continue to make payments on the principal. But if say, for example, I get that loan and I don't make the first payment. Well, the first month there's $1,000 of interest, and the second month there's $1,000 of interest. And if I continue not making payments, obviously at some point I'm going to default on the loan. But if I continue not making payments, the interest just keeps racking up. Whereas I think I've never bought a car or a house or whatever in the Islamic world, but I think what happens is in the Islamic world is we calculated, okay, on $100,000, you get a $10,000 fee. That's it. There is no runaway clock. So I think if we were to say, okay, if we're going to have the government make the payments on loans that are generated for businesses, then, make it a fee where, okay, you get a capped amount of money. There's no runaway stuff that can happen, right? And I'm not saying I know specifically how that would look like giving some sort of incentive to make sure that the person's not late or the person is, doesn't default or whatever, to say, okay, if the business defaults, you don't get the money, or if the person's late, you get half the money for that pay, whatever. The point being, what is the societal reason for having borrowers pay back money at interest to a banking system that generates the money out of nothing, presumably for the welfare of the society? It's supposed to be the money generating arm for the society to get money where it's needed. Why should they pay back interest directly? The second argument I could hear against this is that, well, there needs to be a motivation to make sure that the business owner doesn't just take the money and be like, yeah, well, I don't care that much. Why should I bother paying it back? And that the interest is that motivator. I would argue that whether or not there's interest, the fact that there's a debt payment is that motivator. I mean, I understand that the difference between interest and principal can make a difference on your taxes. It can make a difference in terms of, refinancing debt or selling a business and seeing how much debt is left, right? Because, for example, if I've got $100,000 debt, which if I pay it all the way off is going to turn into $10,000 of interest. So in total, that's $110,000 versus if I have $110,000 debt, that's all principal and no interest. If I sell the business, on the first one, there's only $100,000 debt because the interest goes away from getting paid early. Whereas the second option, there is a $110,000 debt that has to be paid off. I get that there's a difference there. However, this is all downstream and secondary to cash flow. When it comes to business, the only thing that really matters is the cash flow. The only thing that really matters is the cash flow. And cash flow is how much money came in versus how much money came out. And whether that money coming out went to principal or whether it went to interest, the cash flow doesn't care, right? Meaning the motivation on the business owner doesn't change because it's affecting the cash flow the same way. You follow me? It's affecting the cash flow the same way. So the two arguments I could see against it, the first one, seeing against the idea of why even bother having people pay back interest to the banking system, particularly for business-related activities. I'm going to get to assets in a second. For business, why even have them do it for business-related activities when the banking system generates the money out of nothing? There is no time value of money when you generate it out of nothing. And one way or the other, the government is directly creating the money for the difference of the money generated versus the amount of money that has to be paid back. And the amount of money that has to be paid back is always greater than the amount of money generated. Why do they have to do that? And if you say, okay, well, the bank needs the incentive in order to be a business and act with some sort of private sector flexibility. Like I said, why not just create the same or similar system where the bank gets paid directly by the government? Remember, all this stuff is just people typing numbers into computer screens, right? So when the payment is made and the bank has to type a new number into the computer screen saying, okay, well, we received this payment, so the debt went down on the liability and the asset moved around. And the government says, because this is all legally defined anyway, legally, if that person made their payment on time, give yourself $10. Good job, right? Why can't you do that? And then secondly, if, the motivation still needs to be there for the business to basically move its ass and be profitable in order to make the debt payment, I just don't see how, whether the debt payment is principal or principal plus interest, how that changes the motivation of the business owner to do a good job in order to pay the debt back. So secondly, I want to address assets, purchases for assets, because as we've reviewed and talked about Richard Werner, we've talked about how asset purchases are by nature inflationary. If you're generating money to purchase houses, to purchase cars, to purchase stocks, to speculate on whatever, you are creating more money to bid on the same amount of goods, right? I wonder, I'm completely hypothesizing here. I don't know, I think it's a good question to ask of, should money be generated for the purposes of those purchases? I'm not saying I'm not asking whether or not people should borrow, but should money be generated for those purposes? I think not, because that's the naturally inflationary thing, and that's where all these stupid economic bubbles come from, housing bubble or whatever, student debt bubble, whatever. And then I guess the student debt one's weird because theoretically that was supposed to, end up creating more goods and services, but we all know how that went. So another hypothesis, and I feel less strongly about this or less confidently about this than I do the first half of the hypothesis, is maybe that with asset purchases, let's just keep it at like house and cars for now. If I want to go to a bank and make an asset purchase, in that point, I do have to actually borrow somebody else's money. And maybe that's where the investment opportunities come from the depositors, right? Okay, here's Dylan. He wants to buy a $100,000 house. And how many people are interested in pulling their savings account together to get a return on investment from Dylan purchasing this house? Now we're running back into the usury thing again, and should I, purchasing the house, be the one that has to, pay the difference on the investment, or is that something where the guy? I don't know about that. I mean, this is something that'd have to be experimented with in order to really make a determination on that. But then the bank can kind of act as two separate things, where they got money creation on one hand, and on the other hand, they're looking to optimize investments for depositors. And in order to not worry about having a run on a bank, it would be okay. It'd be clear that you depositors who are investing money, so Dylan can borrow it and go buy this house, that money is not available to you until it gets paid back. I mean, just like any other investment, right? If I put money on the stock market, I can't simultaneously keep that money on the stock market and take it out and go spend it somewhere else. So the more and more we talk about economics here, the more and more I think about how could the system be better designed. And I've said many, many times that all these people who want to say, okay, we need a system that does this, we need a system that does that, particularly from like the Austrian and libertarian camps, you don't understand how the system works now. And the more and more I read and talk and research and have Nima correct me on this topic, the more I start to think about, okay, how could the system be generated better? And I think the easiest thing to do, I mean, I understand this would be difficult from a societal perspective because nobody understands what I'm talking about unless you listen to the show anyway. But I think it wouldn't be that hard to look at the current the system as it exists now and just say, okay, well, let's just change the way that the money moves. At the end of the day, the money gets paid by the banks collect their interest by money generated by the government. So why not just pay it to them directly? I don't know. Well, I mean, tell me what you think about this idea, because I do think I'm onto something, but maybe I'm crazy. This has been Dylan Moore with Irita TV, which you could find at irita.tv. I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to your feedback.